Hi, everybody. Hi to people at home. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our panelists. Hi, everybody. Just going to let folks settle in. You're at Internationalism Belongs in the NDP leadership race. And we're just going to give folks a minute to arrive and settle in. Tonight's online rally is called Internationalism Belongs in the NDP leadership race. And it is wonderful to see so many people joining from home. The chat is open. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Let us know the territories that you're on. We'd love to hear from people at home. As always, keep your comments comradely. But yeah, let's this is we're cheering on the mainstreaming of internationalism in the NDP and beyond. So as we kind of settle in, we're going to start off with a powerful 2.5-minute, it's actually a mid-production trailer that's called Our Country, Our Name, and it's by Hossein Martin Fazeli and Fariba Farkam. And it's never before seen footage from a project that, I guess unsurprisingly, never received the full funding that it needed to be finished. Nobody wanted to fund a critical film on Canadian foreign policy. So, I mean, it's heartbreaking, but, nonetheless, we're going to share this because it's beautiful and moving, and it speaks directly to the themes that we're here talking about: war, empire, and whose lives matter. So as we settle in together, here's the mid-production trailer from Our Country, Our Name. Just give me 1 second. Oh, it looks like it does not want to share. Just give me 1 moment. Country name, screen share. Here we go. Okay.
We are a peaceful country, and an important Canadian value has always been to bring about peace on the international stage.
Everything changed from 1 second to the other. Like all of a sudden the city was dead and there was just this chronic drone of terror.
Canada has taken certain positive steps on the international stage, but it also has done a lot of negative stuff. South Africa, 1895, El Salvador, 1932, and then again in the 80s, Korea, 1950 to 1955, Vietnam during the 60s and 70s, Iran, 1953, Chile, 1973, Haiti, 2004, and the list goes on and on and on.
People think we didn't participate in the Iraq war, but we did, just indirectly.
Anytime the U.S. goes to war, Canada's going to be part of that war.
What Eve did is expose realities that Canadians should be aware of.
Canada's the most aligned with U.S. foreign policy, certainly in terms of the integration with the military.
The West is an alliance, and we are all a part of something far larger than ourselves. We're in it together.
They spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year trying to positively portray Canadian foreign policy.
So many people suffering in the world. And the pain that you get to see, it's too much.
There's a responsibility for what's being done in our name. In many cases, the foreign policy is being done in my name and all other Canadians' name.
Who is making the decisions? Who is responsible for this? Maybe it's time we talk about it.
So that was Our Country, Our Name And that was that's a mid-production trailer. And just thank you so much to Hossein and Fariba for allowing us to share that with you. They sent it to us really specifically for tonight, and that hasn't been seen before. So again, welcome to everybody. My name is Bianca Mageni, and I'm moderating tonight's online rally, Internationalism Belongs in the NDP Leadership Race. I'm here with the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, and really grateful that you've all joined us this evening. I'm joining you from Jojage, which is also known as Montreal, on the traditional unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people. And we're meeting at a very stark moment. We've just seen the passing of Carney's war budget with massive new spending on weapons, on war. We're seeing Canadian troops currently participating in IOF seminars while Israel stands accused of genocide in Gaza. We're seeing Canada's foreign minister effectively saying that it's up to the US to decide whether blowing up boats in the Caribbean violates international law. And so the need for internationalism, for anti-imperialism in official Canadian politics honestly couldn't be clearer. And yet inside the NDP, the party brass are currently undercutting a leadership campaign that is rooted in anti-imperialism and anti-racism, rooted in anti-militarism, a campaign that's put forward a comprehensive platform calling for Canada to withdraw from the racist core group in Haiti, from the Five Eyes intelligence network, and that directly challenges the unjust global order that's built on the so-called white man's burden. And so I want to say this as clearly as possible. If a party sidelines or excludes a campaign, the one campaign that is actually centering Gaza, Haiti, Congo, Venezuela, Chile, Cuba, Palestine, the wider global south, then what it is really saying is that the lives and livelihoods of those people are not a priority in Canadian politics or for the party, and that is racist. You cannot call yourself a serious anti-racist and then treat the majority of the world's racialized and Indigenous peoples as an afterthought in foreign policy. You can't say Black Lives Matter or that you stand against Islamophobia or colonialism and then look away when your party funds wars, sanctions, occupations that devastate Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities abroad. So if we're serious about challenging racism, we have to be anti-imperialist, we have to be anti-war, we have to be anti-genocide, and we must be internationalists. We have to center these questions. We can't treat them as optional add-ons. Anything less than that is deeply unserious and performative. So tonight is about substance. It's about how Canadian policy is tied up with racism, with austerity, with climate breakdown, and attacks on democracy at home. And it's also about something very specific and immediate, the struggle for space to even talk about Canadian imperialism inside the NDP leadership race. So with that, I cannot wait to introduce our incredible lineup of speakers today. There's just a little bit of housekeeping, a few quick logistics. We're going to be keeping things very, very tight on time because we do have so many speakers. So speakers will be keeping their remarks quite brief and we'll be moving it along quite quickly. We will hopefully have a bit of time for a short Q&A or discussion at the end. And also our final live speaker, unfortunately, Maria Paez Victor was not able to make it last minute, but did send us a video. So we'll be showing that closer to the end. Okay, and so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who's going to give us an overview. Vijay Prashad, historian, journalist, and author of a dozen books on imperialism in the Global South. He's the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Vijay, thank you so much for being here. Over to you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for having me. And I really endorse everything you said earlier. It is interesting to speak about Canada. And I'm very happy that there's so many people here to participate in this because, Canada is one of those curious countries in the world. It has a self-reputation of being somehow, let's say, use the word liberal or far-sighted or not as bad as the United States. Let's leave it at that. It's not the United States, as if that's a enormously high standard for a country to hold itself to. We're better than the United States. Well, that's really interesting, because the United States is perhaps the most vicious country, at least its government is, and uses its own power ahead of any other form of international agreement. I mean, bombing boats in the Caribbean, the ridiculousness of it apart. I mean, it's ridiculous. The volume of drugs that's entering North America, it's not coming on tiny cigarette boats that are being blown up in the Caribbean. People who have faced no arrest, no trial, their names are not even released to the public, just blown up. And Canada, in most of these US foreign policy decisions, tags along. And I think that's another way in which people see this. If they don't see Canada as innocent, or at least better than the United States, they think that Canada just sort of tags along, and all of this is good for the United States, but Canada really isn't benefiting from it, not at all. That's actually perhaps an even larger myth. In fact, Canada benefits from these, adventures overseas. It benefits deeply. How does it benefit? I mean, we did a study some years ago of the biggest mining companies in the world that create havoc and despair around the world. First among them is Barrick Gold, which is a Canadian mining company. In fact, Barrick Gold's then CEO, at the time of Hugo Chavez's ascension by a democratic election to the government of Venezuela, at that time, the head of Barrick Gold basically wrote in the Toronto Mail and whatever it's called, Guardian, I suppose, wrote in the newspaper saying, let's just coup this guy. That's the attitude of the mining executives. I've traveled to some of these mines in Papua New Guinea, in South America, where I'm speaking to you from. Canadian mines are everywhere, and these mining companies behave atrociously, completely against the laws of the countries where they operate, completely against international laws, and certainly against Canadian laws, reaping super profits, bringing these, not to the ordinary Canadian citizen, but bringing it into whatever wealth, mechanisms exist in Canada, certainly into BlackRock and other US holding companies that hold that wealth for them. In this way, Canada, or at least its mining companies, its weapons manufacturers, its weapons designers, and so on, benefit greatly from these wars, these genocides, these endless attempts to suppress people in order to take profit out, of these countries, to basically impoverish these countries. You can't say that Canada is innocent. Somebody needs to say that it's not an innocent country. Somebody needs to say that. Somebody needs to say that the standard of being better than the United States is hardly worth, the price of a cup of coffee at, what's that Canadian coffee chain called? Or is that even owned by somebody in the United States? Hard to say. And certainly, I would say that you can't say that Canada merely tags along. It does not merely tag along. Canada is, in fact, one of the leaders in this. It sometimes goes from the front rather than from behind in some of these operations. Think about the suppression of the rights of the people in Haiti. In Haiti, Canada was not innocent. It did not tag along. It's been right there since the very beginning. You can say the Canadian slave trade wasn't as bad as the slave trade in the American South. We know well enough that the history in the country, in Canada, is also a history of amnesia, about not only the historic crimes against the native people, but the continuing crimes against the native people. And guess what? Often engineered by large mining companies, large companies that want to extract wealth from the soil owned by the native people. I mean, it's not like it's not happening now. It's not a historical fact. It's a fact that repeats itself. You know, Marx wrote that capitalism functions based on primeval accumulation. Primeval accumulation has to happen over and over again. And always, always, it seems, at the cost of the lives of people who have historically had their land and labor taken from them and whose descendants continue to have their land and labor taken from them. Look, it's not easy in a country like Canada to come to power. It's not easy in a country like Canada to change the policy. But it is important to have authentic oppositional voices that loud and clear, without any fear, and therefore engineering a lack of fear among the population, which will follow such political leadership. It's very important to have voices, important voices in political parties raising these issues. So there it is, friends. It's not innocent. It's not just tagging along. It needs political voices to say, stop it, and stop it now. Thanks a lot.
Terrific. Thank you, Vijay, for that grounding, for a much better understanding for many of how Canada fits into the global picture. And yes, better than the US is worth less than a cup of Tim Hortons. And we are not simply holding the bully's coat. Thrilled to hear from you. The next speaker is Tamara Lawrence, who will be talking about our recent war budget and more. Tamara is a researcher and peace activist, a member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, the Canadian Pugwash Group, the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and has worked extensively on militarism, climate, and the federal budget. Welcome, Tamara.
Good evening, everyone. It's really great to be with you all. So Canada's federal budget says a lot about Canada's role in the world. For the past 30 years, under successive Liberal and Conservative governments, Canada's military spending has risen to a record level. This has made Canada's foreign policy posture very aggressive. Since 1999, Canada has engaged in endless US-led wars in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Ukraine. We are not innocent, just as Vijay said. Last year, Canada's military spending was $44 billion, according to NATO's latest defense expenditures report. And at this level, Canada is ranked 16th in the world for military spending, and it's going to get much worse. Last Thursday, the House of Commons voted to pass Carney's budget. The top priority is rebuild, rearm, and reinvest in the Canadian Armed Forces. The budget as well states that Canada will reach NATO's 2% target this year, 5 years early, which will mean an increase to $64 billion on the military. And then over the next decade, military spending will increase to $150 billion annually to reach NATO's 5% GDP target by 2035. Ottawa is also establishing a new defense industrial strategy to increase weapons production in the country, and this will mean more arms sales to foreign destinations like Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. And with all of this public money, Ottawa is buying new submarines, armored vehicles, drones, and long-range precision strike capabilities. So we have to pause and ask, why is the Carney government rearming the Canadian military? Why the rush? What is Canada, which country is Canada going to strike? Well, 3 weeks ago in Bucharest at the NATO Industry Forum called Rearming NATO, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said, quote, Russia will remain a destabilizing force in Europe and the world, along with China, Iran, and North Korea. And they are preparing for long-term confrontation. This is a bald lie. It is NATO that is planning for long-term confrontation against these countries. As well, I want to emphasize that Canada's budget does not even mention the word peacekeeping once. Canada's contribution to United Nations peacekeeping is at its lowest level, with only 27 Canadian soldiers wearing blue helmets. By contrast, on one NATO operation, in Latvia, Canada has over 2,000 soldiers. What Canada is doing is war making with NATO and not peacekeeping with the UN. Finally, in September, I want to bring to your attention that the UN released a really important report entitled The Security We Need, Rebalancing Military Spending for a Sustainable and Peaceful Future. It calls for cutting military spending for human needs, for climate action, and sustainable development. I want to say that Eve Engler knows how crucial it is that Canada defund the military and work to disband NATO. Support Eve Engler and get Canada out of NATO. Canada out of NATO. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tamara. As always, thank you for laying out also where our public money is actually going and what that means for the rest of us and for the rest of the world. We're now going to zoom in on Gaza and the UN. Our next speaker is Craig Mokhiber, an international human rights lawyer and activist who headed the UN Human Rights Office in New York. Craig, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Good to be with everybody. I'm just over the river in Niagara Falls, New York right now. I can literally see Canada from the end of my street, and it used to be something that encouraged me to have it so close by. These days, I'm a bit worried. I'm in a territory that is traditionally that of the Haudenosaunee, the Seneca, the Tuscarora people who have been colonized and have been subjected to gross injustices over the course of many centuries here, much the way the Palestinian people continue to be subjected to the abuses to which indigenous peoples are subjected by empire everywhere on this planet. Sadly, Canada these days is all too often complicit in the persecution of indigenous peoples at home, but also in places like Palestine, as Canada has increasingly become a junior partner in US empire. And while Canada doesn't sit on the Security Council at the moment, its foreign policy is perfectly aligned with the kinds of atrocities that we saw last week in the Security Council, when the Council adopted a resolution that can only be described as 19th century colonialism in the 21st century. More than 2 years into the genocide in Palestine, the Security Council finally acts, and what does it do? Rather than acting to enforce international law, to protect the victims, to hold the perpetrators accountable, it adopted this resolution that openly flouts international law, that disempowers and further punishes the victims, and rewards and empowers the Israeli regime, the key perpetrator here, handing control of Gaza and the survivors of the genocide over to the United States as a co-perpetrator of the genocide, with the participation explicitly of the Israeli regime, the key perpetrator of the genocide. In the plan, the Palestinians themselves are not to be granted any such participation. Now, it's clear that since the UN pretended to partition Palestine against the will of the indigenous people in 1947, the UN has never acted in such a baldly colonial and unlawful way as it did last week, with the complicity of the entire West. The UN Security Council in this resolution effectively hands Gaza over to this US-led colonial body called the Board of Peace, headed by Donald Trump himself, and deploys a proxy occupation force, again, directed by the US under Donald Trump, called the International Stabilization Force. And all of this to be done in consultation with the perpetrator of the genocide, the apartheid regime of Israel. That is truly a day of shame for the United Nations and for all the countries that have participated in this sham. Not a single member of the Security Council had the courage or principle to vote against what can only be seen as a ratification of the genocide in Palestine. And it comes just on the heels of a number of important findings of the International Court of Justice, and in clear violation to every provision that the International Court of Justice has just decided. And so it denies the Palestinian right to self-determination. It reinforces Israeli impunity, even as the genocide continues. And remember, the genocide continues as we speak. There is no ceasefire. There has not been a ceasefire for a single day from the Israeli side. And there is no peace process as such. only an imperial dictate from the United States. Despite the ICJ's findings that the Palestinian people have this right to self-determination on their land, this resolution strips those rights away and empowers hostile foreign forces to govern the Palestinian people against their will. Despite the fact that the court found that all of the occupied Palestinian territory are unlawfully occupied and that the occupation must end immediately, this resolution extends the Israeli occupation, it endorses the indefinite presence of the Israeli regime troops, and then it superimposes another US-led occupation on top of that occupation. And despite the findings of the ICJ that the Palestinians don't have to negotiate for their rights, that those rights are inalienable and they don't have to beg their oppressors or the US empire for them, and that no political process can trump them, this resolution effectively nullifies those rights and assigns the rights of the Palestinian people to the discretion of the United States and to its Israeli and other partners. And nowhere in this resolution is a single mention of the genocide, of the apartheid, or of the colonization of Palestine. Not a single mention of the thousands of Palestinians still held in Israeli torture and death camps. Not a single mention of accountability for the perpetrators or redress for the victims. And not only does it not require Israel to meet its legal obligations of compensation and reparations for its damages, but it takes that responsibility away from the Israelis and then hands it to donors and international financial institutions like the World Bank in what amounts to a multi-billion-dollar bailout of the Israeli regime as it perpetrates a genocide. Full impunity for Israel, its full normalization, even as the genocide continues. It empowers Trump and his board, his colonial board, to control all of the people and processes of Gaza, all services and aid, the movement of people in and out of Gaza, any funding and reconstruction, any other tasks, according to the resolution that may be required, dangerously broadly formulated language like that, handed over to this new colonial authority. No promise of Palestinian statehood or independence or liberation anywhere in here, except that which might be granted at the whim of Donald Trump and his colonial administration. So effectively, what the Security Council has done is to grant a veto to the United States over Palestinian self-determination with input on that from the Israeli regime itself, rewarding the genocide in Palestine and deploying this proxy occupation force called the International Stabilization Force, commanded by Donald Trump himself, that will be empowered to secure the borders, in other words, to further cage the Palestinian people, to suppress any resistance or occupation against occupation, apartheid, or genocide, even though that is an international right of the Palestinian people, to demilitarize Gaza, but not the Israeli regime that perpetrated the genocide, to destroy Gaza's military defense capacities, but not those of the Israeli regime perpetrating genocide, to decommission the weapons of the Palestinian resistance, but not those of the Israeli regime perpetrating the genocide. All of these outrages are explicitly included in this resolution that has just been adopted with a proxy occupation force to control, contain, and disarm the population victimized by genocide, but not the regime that is perpetrating it. And in still another outrageous breach of international law, it also authorizes Israeli regime forces to continue to unlawfully occupy Gaza until the US board decides that it has to end, and that in any event, the resolution provides that the Israeli occupying forces can remain in Gaza in a so-called security perimeter for indefinitely, effectively. I have said about this as I conclude that the world is sleepwalking into an unprecedented period of global tyranny. When the US empire can command this kind of action in the UN Security Council, the UN Security Council, with enormous legislative and enforcement power, unconstrained by international law, becomes not only an instrument of empire, but an instrument of repression that we all should be concerned about when it is not guided by international law, restrained by other members of the council, as it was in this case, violating precisely the rights of the Palestinian people, recently affirmed by the International Court of Justice, and perpetrating an act of collective complicity, a complicity, by the way, that Canada is also responsible for. This resolution has been rejected by all of Palestinian civil society, all of the political and resistance factions, by human rights defenders and international law experts everywhere. It is our job as well to oppose this and to make sure that it is not normalized and that it cannot be implemented. This is not just in the interest of the Palestinian people, but we have argued of all of us who want to be protected from the whims of an empire without international law playing a role. This 19th century form of colonialism being imposed on the long-suffering Palestinian people is something in which we all have a stake. It must be opposed. We have to press member states of the UN to revoke this resolution. We have to press them to convene under the UN General Assembly's Uniting for Peace mechanism to adopt measures to mitigate this. We have to demand an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, and we have to oppose this at every step of the way. Governments have to end their complicity in these abuses. The regime in Israel has to be isolated. Boycott, divestment, sanction, military embargo, judicial prosecutions of Israeli perpetrators, and all of our righteous calls for Palestinian freedom in our millions through demonstrations and strikes and civil disobedience and direct action has to be the order of the day. Canada must end its complicity in the gross violation of international law and in the application of 19th century colonialism in the 21st century. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Shame, shame. It is an absolute shame. It's impossible to understand how this can stand. And after 2 years of a live stream genocide, thank you, Craig, for that rousing, clear-eyed look at the UN, at the Gaza vote, the total lack of accountability and full impunity for a lawless genocidal state, Israel, and those who are allowing it, Canada included, as you said many times, in your talk, outrageous. It is outrageous, and we cannot normalize this. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing with us. So next, we're going to turn to Chile. Our next speaker is Carmen Rodriguez, a Chilean-Canadian writer, educator, political activist who came to Canada as a refugee, political refugee after the 1973 coup, and whose work has explored exile, dictatorship, and resistance for decades. Carmen, thank you so much for being here. Please go ahead. You're just going to have to unmute.
Me now? Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me now? Good. Okay. As Bianca was saying, I am a Chilean Canadian. I came here as a political refugee, as an exile, following the 1973 military coup in Chile. Salvador Allende won the 1970 presidential election in Chile with a program called The Peaceful Road to Socialism, which proposed radical economic and social reforms, including the nationalization of the copper mines owned by US companies. It was a very noble proposal, but not a realistic one, as US imperialism and the Chilean bourgeoisie and oligarchy would not and did not allow its implementation, and carried out a military coup on September 11, 1973, which was mainly financed by the CIA. Now, what was Canada's response to the coup? Then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau recognized the military junta as Chile's legitimate government only 2 weeks after the coup. 2 weeks after the democratically elected president of the country had been killed in the presidential palace while it was being bombed by the Chilean Air Force using US-made Hawker Hunter planes. 2 weeks after a wave of terror had been unleashed in the country, resulting in the death, imprisonment, torture, and disappearance of thousands upon thousands. Much has been said about Canada receiving Chilean refugees with open arms. This is a half-truth. The government of Canada did not receive Chileans with open arms. Many Canadians did, starting with 2 people at the Canadian consular offices in Santiago, 2 people that risked their positions and even their lives by supporting Chilean asylum seekers. They were Chief of Staff Mark Dolgen and an intern, Bob Thompson. When asylum seekers began to enter the consulate in Santiago, Mark Dolgen allowed them to stay, even though Canada did not have specific legislation that established a status for refugees escaping political persecution. And Ottawa was not providing him with any concrete guidance. As the numbers grew, Dolgen lodged people in his own house and in the ambassador's house, who at the time was in Buenos Aires. Young intern Bob Thompson leaked a message that Andrew Ross, the ambassador, the one in Buenos Aires, had sent to Trudeau via cable, in which Ross expressed relief, literally, relief at the overthrow of Allende, and called all leftists riffraff. While the leaked message was a clear expression of disrespect for Allende and Chilean democracy and a simple way of putting Canada's position on the coup into words, it also created momentum and provided fodder for progressive Canadian organizations and individuals who then began a campaign demanding that the country allow persecuted Chileans to come to Canada. In the end, Canada did allow 7,000 of us, but the process was slow, as most of us were accepted as immigrants and had to follow regular migratory channels. A special category was created for those who had sought asylum at the Canadian premises in Santiago, and also for some who were in concentration camps and whose incarceration was permitted for exile. That new category allowed those people to travel to Canada, but on the condition that they renounced any political activity in this country. They were made to sign this document. I think that the Chilean case provides a good example of Canadian foreign policy, which historically and for the most part has aligned with US foreign policies and practices, which are aimed at stopping any kind of leftist governments and movements in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, controlling natural resources and markets around the world, and supporting the arms manufacturing industry. It is a case that we can learn from and that comes as a beacon of Canadian foreign policy, a policy that we must reject and change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Very, very, very important history. Thank you for connecting that history of the coup, exile, your own story to the Canada that we know today. Wonderful to hear from you. We're now moving. Thank you. We're now moving to Central Africa. Our next speaker is Patrick Kimbeko, Canadian geopolitical analyst of Congolese origin and author of several books on Central Africa. Notre prochain intervenant est Patrick Kimbeko, un analyste géopolitique canadien d'origine congolaise et auteur de plusieurs livres sur l'Afrique centrale. Patrick, merci d'être avec nous ce soir. À vous la parole.
Bonjour à tous, merci. J'espère que je ne déroge pas en parlant français. Est-ce qu'on me comprend quand même? J'espère qu'on me comprend. Ah, ok, merci. Merci de m'avoir invité. C'est très intéressant tout ce qui a été dit sur le rôle du Canada. Et souvent, en ce qui concerne l'Afrique, on ne voit pas souvent la main du Canada. Bianca, vous avez raison de dire que j'ai beaucoup écrit sur l'Afrique centrale, mais j'ai aussi écrit sur la guerre de l'OTAN en Libye. Parce que j'ai écrit un livre sur la guerre de l'OTAN en Libye. Et bien entendu, il y a un pays qui a joué un rôle important qui s'appelle le Canada. On a beaucoup parlé du rôle de la France et de la Grande-Bretagne, mais on a peu parlé du rôle du Canada qui avait un commandant à la tête de l'opération de l'OTAN contre la Libye de Muammar Kadhafi. On oublie que le commandant en chef de la force de l'OTAN en Libye était dirigé par un Canadien. On pourrait croire que c'est une nouveauté, mais en réalité, non. Je veux rappeler deux faits importants qui dénotent du rôle du Canada sur le terrain militaire. C'est que la première mission dans laquelle on trouve des Canadiens en Afrique, c'est en 1960, au moment de l'indépendance du Congo. C'est la première mission des Nations Unies au monde qu'on avait appelée l'ONUC. Et l'ONU avait été dirigée par des officiers de plusieurs pays, c'était des casques bleus, mais à la tête desquels on trouvait quand même des Canadiens. Et d'ailleurs, c'est un Canadien, un officier canadien, le lieutenant-colonel Berthiaume, qui avait permis aux troupes de Mobutu et à la CIA d'attraper Lumumba et de l'assassiner. Ça, c'est très peu connu du rôle joué par le Canada dans les guerres en Afrique centrale. Un autre officier canadien à la tête d'une autre mission de maintien de la paix, qui est très connu d'ailleurs de beaucoup de gens, c'est le général Roméo Dallaire. Roméo Dallaire est un homme qui est très connu, qui est devenu sénateur d'ailleurs au Canada. On a fait des films sur lui. Il est considéré comme un héros au Canada. Mais ce que très peu de gens savent, c'est que Roméo Dallaire était en contact avec les Américains qui voulaient redéfinir la carte géopolitique de l'Afrique centrale à l'époque et qui s'était servi de l'actuel président du Rwanda, à l'époque chef rebelle, Paul Kagame, pour mener une guerre qui a mené à ce qu'on a appelé le génocide au Rwanda. Ça, c'est une partie de l'histoire de l'Afrique centrale qui est très peu connue. On parle beaucoup du génocide au Rwanda, on parle beaucoup des crimes qui ont été perpétrés au Congo, on parle beaucoup des guerres qui se déroulent dans cette région, on parle très peu de l'implication des acteurs des pays comme le Canada. Les États-Unis sont réputés être le pays qui intervient dans plusieurs régions du monde. On a vu en 60, on a vu dans les années 90, on le voit encore aujourd'hui. Par contre, ce qu'on a pu observer au niveau de l'Afrique centrale, c'est que les États-Unis ont toujours joué un rôle en complicité avec des Canadiens. Donc, ce que le Canada fait aujourd'hui en soutenant la politique israélienne ou en accompagnant les États-Unis dans son soutien à Israël n'est pas quelque chose de nouveau. On l'observe aussi du côté de l'Afrique centrale, en commençant par en 1960 avec l'assassinat de Lumumba, par la suite dans les années 90, parce qu'à l'époque, à partir des années 90, c'était la fin de la guerre froide, les États-Unis voulaient redéfinir les règles du jeu dans plusieurs régions du monde, y compris en Afrique centrale, qui était à l'époque dominée par les Français. Et les Américains voulaient se débarrasser des Français pour occuper toute la région et contrôler des ressources minérales très importantes qui se trouvent notamment à l'est de la RDC. Et à ce moment-là, certains pays vont jouer un rôle important. Et l'un des pays qui va jouer le rôle le plus important, c'est le Canada. Non seulement le Canada envoie, parce qu'au Canada, on se vante beaucoup d'assister à des missions de maintien de la paix. C'est un cachet, c'est une identité canadienne en matière de maintien de la paix. Souvent, le Canada met de l'avant le fait qu'il envoie des forces de maintien de la paix pour stabiliser des pays. Mais ce qu'on dit très peu, ce que les gens ne comprennent pas, c'est que ces forces de maintien de la paix sont utilisées comme des outils de déstabilisation du Canada, mais aussi de ses alliés de l'OTAN. Et c'est ce qu'on a vu en Afrique centrale à partir des années 90. Et d'ailleurs, je veux te donner un détail important. Vous voyez, pendant le génocide au Rwanda, quand les gens étaient en train de s'entretuer, quand on massacrait les Tutsis, il y avait une force de maintien de la paix sur place qui était dirigée par le général Roméo Dallaire. Et Dallaire a lui-même dit que l'humanité avait failli au Rwanda parce qu'il n'a jamais eu d'intervention pour sauver les gens. Alors, les gens ont la question de savoir pourquoi est-ce qu'on n'avait pas sauvé les gens alors qu'il y avait des casques bleus de l'ONU. La réponse est très simple, c'est qu'à l'époque, les États-Unis soutenaient le groupe rebelle qui était en place, qui combattait le gouvernement qui était en place et qui voulait qu'il s'empare de pouvoir. Et le général Roméo Dallaire va jouer un rôle important en soutenant ces groupes rebelles-là, qui est dirigé par l'actuel président du Rwanda, M. Paul Kagame. Et donc, le pari était de laisser mourir des gens, des Tutsis, particulièrement au Rwanda, pour permettre à un homme de s'emparer du pouvoir. Et cet homme, c'était Kagame, qui était devenu le nouveau sous-traitant des États-Unis en Afrique centrale. Et après la guerre du Rwanda, il y aura sa suite au Congo, où le Rwanda va intervenir en RDC pour, soi-disant, sécuriser sa frontière occidentale, parce qu'au Congo, il y avait des troupes, il y avait des gens qui avaient participé au génocide au Rwanda qui étaient réfugiés au Congo. Encore là, on aura encore une stratégie américaine qui va se mettre en place avec, une fois encore, le soutien du Canada. Parce qu'à l'époque, pendant la guerre du Congo, il y avait des massacres des hommes, des femmes et d'enfants. Il y a un rapport de l'ONU qui est sorti en 2010 qui s'appelle le rapport Mapping, qui parlait d'un possible génocide. À l'époque, il y avait un général canadien qui va prendre la tête de la force multinationale qui devait stabiliser la situation dans la région. Et ce général s'appelle Maurice Baril, qui était à l'époque le chef d'état-major terrestre de l'armée canadienne. Et Baril laissera mourir des hommes, des femmes et des enfants parce qu'il ne fallait pas, en fait, d'être des bâtons à la stratégie américaine qui était pilotée à l'époque par le président Kagame du Rwanda avec le soutien du Canada, parce qu'à l'époque, le Canada avait déployé ses compagnies minières dans la région. Et ces compagnies minières canadiennes vont financer la guerre à l'est du Congo, donc l'actuelle République démocratique du Congo, qui est de l'ex-Zaïre. Ils vont financer des guerres et ce conflit va faire 6 millions de morts selon les Nations Unies. Donc le conflit en Congo aujourd'hui se poursuit et encore une fois, le Canada adopte la même posture qui est de financer des missions humanitaires alors qu'en même temps, on soutient des régimes qui continuent à perpétrer des crimes là-bas pour le plus grand bonheur des multinationales. Parce qu'en réalité, il faut comprendre que la plupart des multinationales qui sont dans la région des Grands Lacs sont basées au Canada, à la bourse de Toronto, ou à la bourse de Vancouver. Et la plupart de ces compagnies minières ont financé les conflits armés dans cette région parce que cette région est très riche en ressources naturelles. Je dois rappeler que l'Est du Congo, on trouve ce qu'on appelle le coltan. Le coltan, c'est 70% des réserves mondiales se trouvent à l'Est du Congo. Le coltan, c'est ce qui sert à fabriquer des téléphones portables, c'est utilisé dans l'industrie de l'armement. C'est vraiment un outil très important. C'est ce qu'on appelle, ça participe. C'est pas un terre rare, mais c'est un peu comme des terres rares. C'est-à-dire, ce sont des minéraux qui sont devenus critiques et qui sont importants pour la technologie du 21e siècle. Et donc, à l'est du Congo, dans la frontière avec le Rwanda, il y a des massacres qui se perpétuent là-bas. Il y a des compagnies minières qui ont été impliquées pendant longtemps et qui ont reçu le soutien du gouvernement canadien parce que la législation canadienne à l'époque faisait en sorte qu'il était difficile de poursuivre des compagnies minières qui étaient impliquées dans des crimes graves dans la région des Grands Lacs. Donc, ce qu'on observe du côté du Canada, en ce qui concerne, par exemple, les opérations de maintien de la paix ou les conflits, c'est qu'il y a une forme de continuum dans la stratégie du Canada qui, d'une part, se présente comme un pays pacifique, un pays qui veut ramener la paix, qui soutient les missions de maintien de la paix et qui, d'autre part, utilise ces missions à des fins géopolitiques et géostratégiques pour sécuriser des intérêts occidentaux et tout particulièrement anglo-saxons dans la région. Et donc, le Canada agit, d'une part, comme, entre guillemets, comme un allié des États-Unis dans plusieurs régions du monde, et en même temps, il joue sa propre partition pour préserver aussi les intérêts particuliers du capitalisme canadien. Donc, on l'observe dans plusieurs régions du monde, et ce qui se passe en Israël, en réalité, ou dans la bande de Gaza, on le voit du côté africain, et pour nous, ce n'est pas très, très surprenant, et il est important, je pense, de mon point de vue, qu'il y ait des gens au Canada qui comprennent ces réalités-là. Ce n'est pas seulement Gaza, c'est un peu partout. On a parlé du Chili, on a aujourd'hui le Congo. Le conflit se poursuit aujourd'hui à l'est du Congo. Il y a près de 7 millions de personnes déplacées. On n'en parle pas. Quand on pose la question aux responsables canadiens, on parle de l'aide humanitaire, mais on occulte un autre fait qui est le soutien apporté non seulement à des groupes armés, mais aussi à des compagnies minières qui propagent la mort et la désolation dans la région. Donc, je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Patrick. Merci d'avoir montré le lien entre la politique canadienne et la violence au Libye, Afrique centrale, Congo, Rwanda. Merci. Thank you, Patrick, for highlighting the ties between Canadian policy, violence in Libya, Central Africa, Congo, Rwanda. Your work is tremendously important, tremendously important. We cannot call ourselves anti-racist, anti-imperialists without an interest, without a knowledge, a deep understanding of African history, current affairs, and our role in all of that. So thank you. I encourage people to find out more about Patrick's work. I know there's probably a number of people that don't speak French in our audience, but please do seek out the work of Patrick Mbeko. It's very important. We're now going to hear from Amina Sheikh. Amina is a union organizer based in Canada. She's the vice president of the Canadian Freelance Union. She served on the executive of the Canada-Cuba Friendship Association, and her work focuses on trade union, interwork solidarity, internationalism. Amina, thank you so much for being here. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amina, and thank you so much for having me tonight. I just first want to situate like how I myself, as a young person in Toronto, I was born to Pakistani parents, and I gravitated towards the NDP right after I graduated from a university in a women's studies program, now called gender studies, and I was a canvasser for two different candidates, members of provincial parliament and MPs in my area of downtown. And, you know, over the years with my participation in the NDP, as a part of the party, a member of the party, a constituent living there, and canvassing my own communities, like canvassing the Muslim community, knocking on doors, I started to become disgruntled, like many other young people and workers, about the party's policies and lack of engagement on issues that matter to us. And some of that may have been Palestine, and some of that may have been for some of my comrades in the trade union movement, taught me about the Caribbean and taught me about Venezuela, taught me about Trinidad, taught me about Guyana. And I really benefited from also being pulled into the trade union movement, because from there I learned about the multiracial working class that's in Canada. And a lot of their issues, not only were they about material issues, you know, the inflation, the cost of living, real life issues, but they also thought about those issues connected to what's going on in the global South, where a lot of communities come from. And so this perspective really helped me and shaped how I saw myself as a trade unionist, but also why I left the party. And I would say that a lot of these issues didn't begin with my involvement. In 2013, the New Democratic Party removed socialism formally from its constitution. And, you know, I wouldn't say this was the beginning of them moving towards the right or the center, but I would say this is one of the chapters that really influenced the ongoing party sort of, you know, sort of hostility, I would say, to the trade union movement and to grassroots organizations, because the party continued to move towards the right. And with that, with the removal of socialism, I would say it had very little internationalism. And what I mean by internationalism, specifically, I was supposed to speak about Cuba. We learn a lot about internationalism through Cuba. Canada is a very privileged country where we have had this ongoing unbroken diplomatic relationships. In March 2025, it was 80 years of diplomatic relationships with Cuba. And this has benefited ordinary Canadians. Millions and millions of Canadians get to go visit Cuba and visit their beautiful beaches, but also learn from the Cuban people. And we have benefited from learning from Cuban people about their revolution, their healthcare, their education, and their unions. And as a trade unionist, I also benefited from learning from trade union activists. These relationships between worker to worker solidarity have been going on for more than 20, 30 years. Major unions like USW, CUPE, British Columbia Teachers Federation, UFCW, private sector unions, and public sector unions continue to engage with Cuba on worker-to-worker conversations, member educations. And not only do we benefit from the tourism, but we've also learned a lot from Cuban people. The Cuban healthcare system is something that Canadian health professionals and Canadian trade unionists continue to tout as one of the best, and it's internationally recognized. But also I wanted to note that, you know, in the pandemic, with everything that was going on, including the far right sort of paving, organizing, and grounds within this country, under the liberal government, and the NDP sort of saying nothing, we saw like even the chief, Jerry Daniels in Manitoba, who represents the Southern Chiefs Organization of 34 nations, he was demanding and encouraging that Canada let in a Cuban health brigade to service these Indigenous nations. And he really said that like the healthcare system is remarkable in Cuba and that Canada would really learn from and benefit from. And during the pandemic, he really raised the alarm about what COVID-19 and the pandemic was doing to this country. And it really wasn't with just the pandemic. I mean, inflation and austerity was happening for decades, but really a lot shifted in that pandemic. And I would say that we should always remember that everything that happened in the pandemic, even with the right organizing under the Freedom Convoy and the attacks on ordinary people that happened under a liberal government. And I would just say that everything that's been happening in this country, it might not be under the conservative government, but it's definitely happening under the liberal and NDP governments. And with that, I really just want to say that ordinary people and workers love going to Cuba. We admire Cuba, and we have a lot to learn from Cuba, and we could do a lot more. And the NDP, to be internationalists, it should be pushing harder for the sanctions to be lifted that are deadly and crippling ordinary Cuban people's lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amina. Thanks for sharing also your personal story and your experience with the NDP, and for connecting labor. We do need to share, and hearing about these powerful exchanges, the worker-to-worker conversations, just the need to talk to the rest of the world, and the need to prioritize internationalism. This is how we build power. Thank you. The next speaker is Karen Rodman. Karen is a human rights advocate and the founder and executive director of Just Peace Advocates, as well as the founder of Palestine Just Trade. And Karen has been working very, very effectively to challenge Canada's complicity in Israel's apartheid system, including through the charity sector. So we're going to hear a bit from Karen on Palestine and the Canada-Israel charity pipeline. Welcome, Karen.
Thanks so much, Bianca. And I'm glad to be here this evening. We, as Canadian taxpayers, are indeed subsidizing war crimes and genocide through the charity tax system. It's in that regard that I'll talk about the Canada Revenue Agency, or CRA, Canada's tax regulator, and its oversight of charity compliance under the Income Tax Act, and in particular, the gaps therein. Some charities like Mizrachi and the United Israel Appeal didn't even meet the basic requirements to report out of Canada recipients until after we started to make complaints to the CRA in 2023. The revocation of Jewish National Fund and Nieman Foundation specifically cite rationale regarding support for illegal settlements and/or support for the Israeli military. However, these charities are often replaced with new burner charities, a term coined by Howe and Sylvester. The revocation of JNF and Nieman are important precedents for the dozens of Canadian charities that are providing funds to illegal settlements or supporting the Israeli military. Over the last several years, Just Peace Advocates has been part of a few dozen complaints of this nature to the Canada Revenue Agency. Evidence shows that the CRA violates its own policies by failing to ensure accurate reporting and by neglecting compliance with the public benefits test. The CRA violates international law by permitting charitable status for organizations that violate the Fourth Geneva Convention, the Rome Statute, and the Genocide Convention. Domestically, CRA practices point to contravention not only of the Income Tax Act, but the Foreign Enlistment Act, the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act, and other legislation. Israel consistently ranks among the top several recipient countries, with about $250 million flowing annually from about 200 Canadian charities to Israeli entities. However, additional funds such as scholarships and operational funds are not necessarily included in these numbers. In addition, foreign universities can register as qualified Canadian donees and thus are not included. Our research shows about $100 million goes annually tax subsidized to Israeli universities from Canadian charities. Further, the 2022 federal budget essentially deregulated the charitable sector. To date, we are aware of over $30 million that have been sent to Israel under this deregulation initiative. Taken together, our analysis shows roughly $500 million of Canadian charitable funds annually reach Israel. During the last government, NDP Nikki Ashton jumped on board with her call for the campaign called Not on Our Dime, using our work for her own fundraising, but other MPs have remained silent. With the CBC Fifth Estate reconstructing our work, the call is becoming quite mainstream. So surely the NDP and other parties could step up and be clear that Canadian taxpayers subsidizing apartheid, war crimes, and genocide is a no-go. There are about 100 individual posts related to Canada to Israel charity pipeline research and advocacy that we've done that are on the Just Peace Advocates website that you can check out. So in conclusion, Canada is in breach of international binding obligations and its own domestic legislation and policy by continuing to allow tax subsidization and sheltering of charitable funds supporting war crimes and genocide. NDP, members of parliament, leadership, and candidates, it's well past time to speak out. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Karen. 100%, 100%. And thank you for just the incredible work that you've done to mainstream and expose this charity pipeline and the Canadian institutions and their funding and normalization for Israeli apartheid, and more generally for the tremendous work that you do to expose Canada's role in Gaza's annihilation right now. Next up, we have Jenny Lore-Sully. We're turning to Haiti. Jenny is a community activist and researcher at IRIS Montreal, whose work has examined Canada's role in Haiti and the racialized politics behind it. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you, Bianca. I'm a former researcher at IRIS. I no longer work at IRIS. I'm a member of Solidarité Québec Haïti. We're a group of activists that have been echoing the Haitian people struggles since at least 2019. And I've been in touch with several solidarity movements. I'm presently in Venezuela. I was invited to observe the communal elections, which is really a privilege for me to be here. And it's great to be able to talk about internationalism from Venezuela and to talk about Haiti from Venezuela before I head back to Montreal, Canada. So I think I'll start by saying that since people have been struggling against imperialism for at least for the past 200 years, we see that there's a dynamic, and here in our hemisphere, the dynamic that we can go back to the Independence Declaration of the United States, which was declared in 1776, and Haiti's Independence Declaration, which was in 1804. And the reason we need to look at those two declarations of independence is because they're opposed. These independence declarations were done for diametrically opposing reason. The United States wanted to be the new dominant force in the world. They wanted to replace the British Empire, and this is why their story from 1776 through today is about global dominance. And we need to understand that. In 1804, what Haitians were declaring is that Haiti was a place of liberty for all human beings. And very often what we don't know about Haiti's history is that it was not just about liberating those on the island. The declaration was for anyone seeking liberty would find it in Haiti. So just I wanted to open up with that and come to what's more recent, the recent news. We need to talk about what Canada is doing in Haiti and what Canada has been doing. really acting as how would I say that they're acting as the good cop to the bad cop. The bad cop is the U.S. and Canada is pretending to be the good cop. Basically, that's what's going on. And of course, when the U.S. has been involved in Haiti, very often it's been very violent, very catastrophic. There was an occupation from 1915 to 1934. And then in many ways, the US has tried to keep control of Haiti, and Canada has helped them keep that control covertly. So Canada has done it behind the scenes. And in recent year, one of the ways Canada has been involved in Haiti is since 2003 with the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti, where it was specifically said that in their view, Haiti's sovereignty was not important. Canada has mining interests in Haiti. Canada has had interest, like they've put together a sort of a system of humanitarian aid, but it's really a humanitarian industry that Canada has put together. And very often when you look at what is invested by Canada in Haiti, it often goes straight back to the coffers of the Canadian government. So it looks like a humanitarianism, but it's really a way of asserting soft power. It's really neocolonialism masquerading as aid. That's what Canada has been doing. I would recommend everyone see the movie by Hélène Brière, Haiti Betrayed, to find out more about how this posturing about aid, how this idea of humanitarianism in Canada is really just a cover for neocolonialism. So what has Canada done since 2004 when the democratically elected president, the last democratically elected president, was removed by the USA and by Canadians who participated in that removal, in that coup against Jean-Bertrand Aristide? Canada has financed the police, and we have a situation where the police is being accused of corruption. So obviously we cannot call that something successful, since we see the state of the police in Haiti today. Canada has financed prisons in Haiti, and there's been all sorts of issues for the last decades in those prisons, so it cannot be called a success. Obviously, it's part of what's wrong with Canada's action in Haiti, the police, the prisons. And Canada has portrayed itself as a feminist force for, Canada has said that their foreign policy is feminist. And honestly, we haven't seen anything to justify this term. It was the ex-prime minister that was saying that. And recently, what's been going on is that the U.S. is trying to intervene again in Haiti, and they've been blocked by Russia or China at the UN Security Council. And what they've done is set up what they're calling the gang repression force. And they're saying that they're going to combat the gangs in Haiti. But you need to know that these so-called gangs are actually being armed with US weapons coming from the US. And Canada is promising to participate in the financing of this new gang repression force, when actually all that Canada really needs to do is put an embargo on the weapons. And that would be a big help for security in Haiti. If there weren't so many weapons going to Haiti. I mean, Haiti does not manufacture weapons. So basically, if you stop the flow of weapons to Haiti, the security problem can be solved. But this is obviously not what the US wants to do. The US wants to arm the gangs and then go fight them with the help of Canada. That's the plan right now. And recently, Marco Rubio was in Ottawa, and Anita Anand pledged $60 million to help that gang repression force in Haiti, and another $20 million to, I think, for a maritime force of the Caribbean. We see what the United States is doing, blowing up boats in the waters near Venezuela. And now we have Anita Anand, from our foreign minister in Canada, promising another extra 20 million for maritime security. So that's really not something that we can look at, and be happy about that, as our tax dollars are going towards such violence. Actually, that's what's going on. We have a situation where violence, destabilization is being created, and the whole region is being affected by that. And as leftists, people from the NPD and NDP should be against that, should clearly denounce what's being done in our name with our tax dollars.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you. Thank you for laying that out so clearly. Canada's ever ongoing intervention in Haiti, also the resistance to it, the notoriously wildly racist core group, and Canada's role in undermining Haitian democracy. It's also wonderful that you're joining us from Venezuela at this critical time. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jenny. Our next speaker is Vitasana Shanmugathas. Vitasana is a documentary filmmaker whose recent film, Truth to the Powerless, Canadian Foreign Policy, examines how Canada behaves on the global stage. And we'll be putting a link to that in the chat. Everybody should watch it. It's an absolute must watch. Welcome, Vitasana.
Thank you, Bianca. In August of 2022, I released Truth to the Powerless, an investigation to Canada's foreign policy. It's a 6-part documentary that brings together voices rarely placed side by side. I interviewed former Canadian defense and foreign affairs ministers, senior diplomats, military officials, members of parliament, as well as some of the sharpest critics of Canadian and Western imperialism, like Noam Chomsky, Yves Engler, Dimitri Lascaris, Richard Sanders, and many others. The purpose of the documentary was simple: put the people who formulated Canadian foreign policy beside the people who have spent their lives challenging and exposing it, and then let the contradictions reveal themselves. And to my knowledge, Truth to the Powerless is the first and only documentary in Canadian history to have accomplished this feat. And that's probably why most people haven't heard of it. The film opens with a message from Noam Chomsky. He says the powerful already know the truth. We don't have to explain it to them. The people who need to know the truth are the powerless, the ones who should overthrow those in power and move towards a more free and just world. And when you present Canada's foreign policy record honestly, what emerges is disturbing. Canada helped found NATO, and in the documentary, I interviewed former Defense Minister David Pratt, who said that Canada insisted the NATO alliance be grounded in fundamental principles, rule of law, human rights, free elections. But as the documentary shows, NATO quickly became an alliance of offensive warfare and regime change. In 1999, NATO launched its first offensive war in Yugoslavia. Canadian fighter jets joined a 78-day bombing campaign with no UN authorization, striking civilian infrastructure, bridges, power plants, even media stations. For the documentary, I interviewed Canadian Major General Louis Mackenzie and Canada's former ambassador to Yugoslavia, James Bissett, who told me plainly the bombing violated international law and made everything worse. And what was the NDP's response? The NDP endorsed the bombing from day one. Sven Robinson, widely seen as the moral conscience of the NDP's left wing, not only supported the war, he urged NATO to send in ground troops. A party that should have stood for peace instead became a voice for escalation. In the NATO bombing of Libya in 2011, Canada led the bombing campaign and a Canadian general ran the mission. Former soldier turned journalist Scott Taylor, interviewed for the documentary, speaks on how NATO manipulated the UN mandate by inventing the term armed civilians, turning a no-fly zone into regime change. Libya, once the most prosperous country in Africa, was shattered. And again, the NDP voted for this war. But my documentary shows NATO isn't the only vehicle Canada uses to overthrow governments it dislikes. In my interview with Bill Graham, who was Canada's foreign affairs minister during the time of the 2004 coup in Haiti, he claimed Aristide was becoming quote unquote dictatorial and insisted Canada wasn't involved in his removal. But Canada's defense minister at the time of the coup, David Pratt, was far more honest. He told me, I quote, Canada, the US, and France did what was necessary in removing Aristide from power. Noam Chomsky in the documentary cut through the propaganda. Chomsky said Aristide had just been democratically elected. He was Haiti's most popular figure. Even if the allegations were true, Chomsky said it's irrelevant. It's up to the Haitians to decide, not to Canada. And yet, in 2021, during the federal election, the NDP formally endorsed Canada's participation in the core group, the colonial oversight mechanism created after the coup. The NDP, a party that should defend Haitian self-determination, instead endorsed the structure that undermines it. In March of last year, on behalf of a legal news publication, I conducted an hour-long interview with Bob Rae, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. On Palestine, when I asked Ambassador Rae why Canada votes against UN resolutions condemning illegal Israeli settlements, Rae dismissed the UN resolutions as, I quote, one-sided. When I raised concerns to Ambassador Rae of Canadian weapon components being used in Israel's assault on Gaza, he denied it. On Ukraine, at the time of my interview with Ambassador Rae, 2 years of war resulted in an estimated 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed and 20% of Ukrainian territory lost. I asked Ambassador Rae whether Canada would be willing to advocate for a diplomatic solution to end the war. I specifically asked whether such a solution could entail acknowledging both Russia and Ukraine's legitimate security interests, possibly including guarantees of Ukrainian neutrality and a written guarantee of non-NATO membership in exchange for the return of occupied territory by Russia. And Ambassador Rae, in his response to my question, went ballistic. He said, I quote, "You're kidding. Are you serious? You think Russia should be rewarded with territory in exchange for its aggression?" He told me appeasement never works, and to dress up appeasement as diplomacy is an affront to diplomacy. And presently, the NDP establishment agrees with Ambassador Rae completely. The party's foreign affairs critic and NDP leadership candidate Heather McPherson pushed Canada's parliament in November 2024 to unanimously endorse Ukraine's future NATO membership. In this regard, she's one of the most hawkish voices in Ottawa. So we have a party that claims the legacy of international solidarity, but repeatedly supports NATO wars in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Libya, endorses the coup-era core group in Haiti, and now backs the NATO proxy war in Ukraine. The NDP needs a candidate to lead the party who offers a genuine alternative, a return to real internationalism, anti-imperialism, anti-racism, aligned with the struggles of the global South and with movements for peace. Truth to the Powerless exists because these conversations are suppressed. You can watch it for free at www.truthtothepowerless.com. And if you find it valuable, please share it and consider donating to it to keep the project alive. And you can watch my interview with Bob Rae. You can read it. Google Bob Rae, jurist, Jurist interview, and you'll find it. We deserve an NDP that stands with the oppressed, not with the architects of empire. If a social democratic party cannot challenge Canadian imperialism, then we must demand that it does. Thank you.
Well, that was rousing, Patasana. Thank you so much. For anyone that hasn't watched it, I think everybody living in Canada needs to watch Truth to the Powerless. It's a powerful film, a narrative lens on Canadian foreign policy, and a huge accomplishment. It's a 6-part series, and it's utterly comprehensive. So please do click the link, watch the film, and keep learning. Thank you, Patasana. Our next speaker is Kevin McKay, who is a social science professor, union activist, author of Radical Transformation, Oligarchy, Collapse, and the Crisis of Civilization. Kevin, thank you for joining us. The mic is yours.
Greetings, friends. Good to be with you this evening in this great event. I think it's super timely. So what I want to talk about is, if the NDP claims to actually represent the interests of the Canadian working class, what would the NDP have to do? And I think it would need to be internationalist and also explicitly anti-imperialist. And unfortunately, as we've heard from so many of the speakers this evening, the NDP is anything but. Instead, it seems to labor under the national delusion that all three parties in Canada share. And this has been addressed by Vijay in his opening comments. This national delusion is that we're the good guys on the global stage. And also that we're a part of this wonderful alliance, NATO, which defends peace and democracy around the world, right? So it's just the perfect place to be. And we have this sort of clean, whitewashed history. And of course, all this does is it denies our history of settler colonialism within Canada, and it denies the many times and the many ways in which we have participated in Western imperialism, and again, has been pointed out, directly benefited from it. And this national delusion and the foreign policy related to it is particularly dangerous today because the world is changing rapidly. And Canada is being forced to drastically reevaluate its global position. The multipolar world is here, and American power is steadily declining. China has successfully challenged Western economic power, while Russia has successfully challenged Western military power. And as many geopolitical analysts point out, the United States has really sown the seeds of its own destruction. Decades of weaponized neoliberal economics and military aggression have birthed a global network of resistance. The China-Russia alliance, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all of these initiatives are finally providing political and economic alternatives to small and middle power nations that are simply tired of US extortion. And this trend is only going to grow. If you look at the United States itself, it's undergoing monumental changes with the rise of fascism, the emergence of AI-driven tech feudalism, and a deep degree of political incoherence and polarization. In terms of foreign policy south of the border, you see a conflict emerging between the old neocon cabal and an emergent realist group, which instead is seeing the return of great power politics and spheres of influence. And you can see this conflict in American foreign policy play out in Ukraine, in the Palestinian genocide, and in the campaign for regime change in Venezuela. And of course, the retrenchment of US hegemony in the Americas is also reflected in threats against Mexico, Colombia, renewed economic aggression towards Cuba, and even the threats to annex Canada. So this is like the Monroe Doctrine on steroids. Another result of this geopolitical realignment is, sadly, fossil fuel production has been increasing, and policy and action on climate change have been all but squashed in North America. Trump and the GOP are blatant climate deniers. So we face a situation where there's actually several existential threats that not just Canadians, but citizens around the world face. We're looking at runaway climate change, the threat of nuclear war, broad-based ecosystem collapse, runaway AI development, and also increasing inequality and social instability. And in order to meet the challenges of this moment, Canada is going to have to undergo a radical transformation and an equally far-reaching transformation in our foreign policy. Domestically, this centers on struggling to dismantle neoliberal capitalism and to build a democratic, eco-socialist society. And I don't have time to get into what that sort of society would look like, but I can direct everyone to Eve Engler's policy platform document, which is a great start. And it's a wonderful document that should be widely read. It talks about building eco-socialism in Canada. However, we're talking about foreign policy this evening. And so I think the first thing Canada has to do is to resist the gravity of two very bad ideas. And we can see these playing out in our political discourse right now within the country. One of these bad ideas is to double down on supporting the United States, committing to joint military projects, continuing to be complicit with US demands for sanctions and provocations against China, Russia, India, and Latin America. And I would hope that the essential insanity of this position is apparent. It's like roping ourselves to the sinking stone of American empire. Bad idea. But a second bad idea that's being floated, which it seems, Carney is also flirting with, is instead doubling down on the NATO alliance with Europe, which again means alienating Russia and China and essentially ropes us to the EU's toxic politics, which is trapped in age-old imperialist rivalries between Britain, France, Germany, and Russia. And so really, instead of these two political dead ends, Canada needs to pursue a different path, a path of sovereignty, self-sufficiency, and international solidarity. And of all the major Canadian political parties, for all its flaws, the NDP is still the best vehicle for this task of the major parties. We have had a hard time setting our own foreign policy agenda because we have been roped to the United States so tightly. We need the political and economic sovereignty to make decisions that benefit the Canadian working class and that contribute to a global culture of cooperation. This means things like getting away from joint projects like the Golden Dome, like the F-35 fighter program, reducing the interoperability of forces between us and the United States. It means not funding NATO imperialist adventures. It means not funding the genocide in Palestine, stepping back from all of these toxic and destructive commitments. It means obviously developing our national economic self-sufficiency as well. And hopefully this will be driven by public investment and not just giveaways to private corporations. And economic self-sufficiency also means diversifying our trade networks. Canada should apply for BRICS membership. This is something that's in Eve's policy platform. It was wonderful to see it there. We should be reaching out to the global economy or to the economies of the global South. And in particular, we should be reaching out to the other countries in the Americas. Instead of remaining silent in the face of US intimidation and threats, we should be building alliances with Venezuela, Mexico, Colombia, and Cuba. We should be standing up in defense of their sovereignty and building alliances, offering diplomatic and economic assistance to these embattled countries. And, we also need to be working internationally to create frameworks for safe AI development that are cooperative, democratic, and ecologically optimized. We have to get together as a global community in order to solve these big issues. We can't do it in a polarized, hostile world of dueling, a declining empire and dueling power centers. So ultimately, the challenges of the present will only be solved, really, by movements of the diverse working class, both in Canada, in the United States, and around the world. The NDP can be a vehicle for this kind of change in Canada. But it won't happen unless it finally confronts, like I said, this delusional foreign policy, and until it embraces a more factual, internationalist, and anti-imperialist foreign policy framework. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you so much. It's great to hear these emerging trends outlined. A great education for all of us and the geopolitical alignments that we're seeing, this increased support for the US, for NATO, for Israel, for empire. And just, it's kind of terrifying to hear you talk about these expanding existential threats and the way that we seem to be barreling headlong in their direction. So yes, Canada needs an independent foreign policy, internationalism, diplomacy, and like you said, or outlined, it really is our best bet for survival. Thank you. Next, we're going to be hearing from Khaled Muammar. We're heading back to discussion around Gaza, Palestine, and Canada. Khaled is the former national president of the Canadian Arab Federation and longtime advocate for Palestinian rights and a critic of Canada's support for Israeli apartheid. Khaled, thank you for being with us. Over to you.
Thank you, Bianca. Since 2007, United Nations bodies and human rights groups have concluded that Israel maintains an apartheid system rooted in religious supremacy. Israel's nation-state law affirms that Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people only, and that they only have the right of self-determination. Since 1948, more than 1,000 communities or towns have been established in Israel to accommodate only Jewish citizens. Meanwhile, a quarter of the 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel are internally displaced persons who have no right, have been denied the right to return to their properties since 1948. Despite this, Canadian officials continue to reject the finding that Israel practices apartheid, insisting instead that Canada and Israel share democratic values and commitments to human rights, claims that make a mockery of our own Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In July 2024, the International Court of Justice ruled that Israel's occupation and colonies in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip is illegal, must be ended rapidly, and that third states are obligated not to aid or assist in maintaining it. So Canada is obligated under its own law, the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act, to investigate and prosecute anyone affiliated with or complicit in the Israeli occupation forces or the illegal colonies. Instead of that, under the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, goods produced in Israeli colonies are allowed to enter Canada tariff-free. And Canada permits, as Karen said earlier, hundreds of registered charities to send tax-deductible donations to Israeli military units and colonies. Also, Canadian citizens are allowed to reside in Israeli colonies without any consequence or investigation. In September of this year, the UN Commission of Inquiry concluded that Israel is committing genocide in the Gaza Strip, and since then, this has been expanded to include the West Bank, which obligates Canada as a signatory to the Genocide Convention to enforce its own genocide and crime against humanity legislation against individuals and organizations complicit in abetting or justifying apartheid Israel's genocide. Instead, Canada continues to export arms to and to import arms from Israel, strengthening Israel's capacity to inflict further harm not only on Palestinians but on neighboring Arab countries like Lebanon and Syria, allows Canadians to serve in the Israeli military without any investigation or prosecution, allows Israel to openly recruit Canadians on Canadian soil to join the armed forces, and Canada provides platforms and impunity to individuals and groups who defend Israeli crimes and threaten anyone who acknowledges Israeli crimes and promote anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Arab racism, and anti-Muslim racism. In short, Canada is complicit in Israel's apartheid, occupation, colonization, and genocide by providing military, economic, and diplomatic support, and by its failure to abide by its own charter, legislation, and international law. The New Democratic Party must openly expose and oppose Canada's complicity in apartheid Israel's occupation and genocide in Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Khaled, for that powerful, powerful call to action for the NDP, for all people living in Canada, to oppose Canada's role in propping up Israel's annihilation of Gaza. Thank you for your long-time activism, advocacy, and criticism of Canada's support for Israeli apartheid. We're next going to hear from William Deere. William is a community activist and the author of the very important and renowned book, Being Chinese in Canada, The Struggle for Identity, Redress, and Belonging, which chronicles the head tack redress movement and systemic racism against Chinese communities in Canada. Welcome, William.
Thank you, Bianca. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for inviting me. What kind of spirit is this that makes a foreigner selfishly adopt the cause of the Chinese people's liberation as its own? It is the spirit of internationalism. Mao Zedong wrote this in his essay, In Memory of Norman Bethune. Norman Bethune was a Canadian doctor who gave his life for the Chinese Revolution. Due to his internationalism, the Chinese people held Canada in high esteem. We can follow the example of Dr. Bethune to support the liberation struggles of the oppressed peoples of the world. Today, the foremost struggle against imperialism and colonialism is the struggle for the national liberation of the Palestinian people. Internationalism in the global fight for justice and peace transcends humanitarianism. The NDP has a hostile history towards China. Like other Western social democratic parties, its views on socialist countries like China are tainted by anti-communism and the holier-than-thou democracy signaling. The NDP is mired in Cold War thinking. It is now stuck in a Cold War mentality on China. They do not have an independent foreign policy, nor any hint of internationalism on the liberation struggles of people resisting imperialism and colonialism. It follows the imperialist dictates of Big Daddy United States, on NATO, and as always, on China. There is hope with Eve Engler joining the NDP leadership campaign that the rank and file will address the difficult question to formulate an honest and respectful approach to the People's Republic of China. However, the NDP maintains the Western political thought on China, a country that is authoritarian, repressive, there's Chinese interference, and China is a threat to the Canadian way of life and values. These attitudes have a dangerous effect on the democratic rights of Chinese Canadians living here. We are in an atmosphere of xenophobia, yellow peril, the toxic mix of the China threat with the Red Scare and McCarthyism. Sentiments propagated by the political parties, including the NDP, the mainstream media, and the security establishment, not only affects relations with China, but more importantly for Chinese Canadians, it is a chilling time for the community within this oppressive atmosphere. Our democratic rights and freedoms are under assault. We cannot fully participate in the political process without our candidates and our voting intentions being suspect. Our social service organizations have been attacked. The Chinese Family Service of Greater Montreal nearly had to shut down due to the 2-year RCMP investigation looking for the so-called Chinese police stations. During this time, the NDP leadership did not say a single word to defend the Chinese community's democratic rights and freedom. So for the NDP to have any relevance for the Chinese Canadian community and other minorities, it must change its policies and develop an independent internationalist approach in foreign affairs, because these policies will also affect the diaspora communities in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Thank you. Very, very important perspective. Thank you to William, longtime community activist. Thanks for joining us, for connecting Canada's China policy also to the lived realities of Chinese communities here in Canada. Thank you. And for people at home, please check out Being Chinese in Canada, The Struggle for Identity, Redress, and Belonging. Absolute must read for everybody living in Canada. Next up, we're going to be hearing from Glenn Michalchuk. Glenn is our final live speaker, and he's going to be focusing on Ukraine. Glenn is a longtime peace activist, a social justice activist. Hold on a second. I'm not sure if you all can see me. Here I am. Glenn is also the president of the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians and has been active for decades in both the labor and peace movements. Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. Very, very good discussion. And I'd just like to talk about, as you said, the war in Ukraine, because that does highlight some very important things for us. It's an important thing for people to understand about the devastating war in Ukraine is that Canada failed to be a voice for diplomacy and reason. It consistently chose to escalate tensions rather than find solutions. Years before the Russian invasion of February 2022, Canada was instrumental in the plans to bring Ukraine into NATO. It spent millions on Operation Unifier to make Ukraine's armed forces ready for NATO integration and command. Following the Maidan coup of 2014, it supported the Kiev government in the civil war that broke out as eastern Ukraine rose up in opposition to that coup. In the months before the Russian invasion of 2022, the Canadian government pursued escalation over diplomacy and de-escalation. When war broke out, it chose to escalate rather than find a way to peace. And it continues to do so as the situation calls out for negotiations. It did all this because the very essence of Canadian foreign policy is to impose the geopolitical order of Western imperialism. NATO is the primary instrument of this. As long as Canada remains a part of NATO, it will be tied to militarism over building diplomacy and respect for nations. It will be a destabilizing and destructive force in the world. Ukraine is but the latest victim. You can add to that Syria, Yugoslavia, Iraq. In all those, Canada played a very devious and nefarious role. Militarism also brings with it suppression of opposition. Suppression of the truth and facts about the war in Ukraine has been an essential feature of its promotion. It involves both state and non-state actors. It has involved the silencing of any opinion against the narrative. It has banned news outlets. It has gone so far as to make it official policy that any description of the war in Ukraine as a proxy war is simply Russian disinformation. And that is something that you find on the Canadian foreign policy website, the foreign policy website of the Canadian government, that any reference to the war being a proxy war is Russian disinformation. Just in conclusion, I would like to emphasize that this is a crucial struggle to defeat the politics, culture, and organization of militarism. Our very future depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you for that perspective on Ukraine, peace, Canada's role, diplomacy, not arms, solutions, not escalation. This is the peace position. Glenn is president of the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians. Great to hear from you, Glenn. We're now going to watch a submission from Maria Paez-Victor, who couldn't be here. Maria is a Venezuelan-born sociologist and commentator who has long written and spoken about Venezuela, imperialism, and Canadian foreign policy. She couldn't be here with us live tonight, but very generously shared a clip with us. Zachariah, could you share that with folks? I think the volume is off. You may need to unmute yourself. I don't know if you're muted, Zachariah.
Yves Engler is one of the very few Canadians that has defended Venezuela's sovereignty and self-determination and deplored all the US attacks against it. A clear declaration of purpose from the Canadian federal government was the official statement from the King. On May 27th this year, King Charles III made a trip to Ottawa, which was admirable as it was Must have been very arduous for him personally, as he was in the middle of cancer treatment. He came to assert Canada's sovereignty in view of Trump's threat of assimilation. In the King's Throat speech, written, of course, as is normal, by the Prime Minister, he said, and I quote, "Democracy, pluralism, the rule of law, self-determination, and freedom are values which Canadians hold dear and ones which the government is determined to protect. This is the theory, the Canada we wish to be, but in reality, we have a foreign policy that mostly follows the dictates of Washington. And this has gone on for a long time, even now, when the sitting US president has started a conflict with Canada. Canada's rhetoric of defending the so-called rule of law and right to self-determination seem to apply not at all to all countries, only to those that align to its interest. And unfortunately, these seem to align with those of Washington. This is particularly damning as it pertains to Latin America. At the G7 meeting a week ago, Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand disgracefully said that it was up to the US to decide if it violated international law or not with the Caribbean boat strikes. In other words, it was up to the criminal to say whether he had committed or not a crime. Astonishingly, Anand is supposedly a law professor. Lloyd Axworthy, himself a law expert, has criticized her, saying, quote, "There is no question that under international law, actions taken are subject to legal standards and they are not adjudicated by the offending party." Canadian economic independence from the USA is not enough. It must also decouple itself politically from its most imperial manifestations, regime change adventures, funding extremist oppositions, a host of covert operations, and imposing unjustified economic sanctions. Simply put, the US attacks Venezuela because of greed to possess its oil and mineral resources, as Trump has openly admitted. Unfortunately, Canada has been directly complicit with sanctions and many covert operations in Venezuela throughout the years, sanctions that have killed more than 100,000 Venezuelans. Canada should no longer simply accept Washington's definition of who is democratic and who is not, and whom to befriend. This has not served Canadian interest, but instead has isolated it, resulting in mistrust in the region and the world. Twice, Canada was denied a seat at the UN Security Council in 2010 and 2020, primarily because Canada was perceived as indistinguishable from the USA and certainly not independent of it. Canada did not defend the Universal Declaration of Human Rights when Venezuelans were rounded up like criminals without benefit of a defense and forcefully sent to a brutal prison in El Salvador. Even Nazi butchers were allowed a trial and lawyers, but not so Venezuelans, who were singled out solely because of their nationality. If any other government had done this, Canada would have been denouncing this vigorously. There is no basis to the claim that Venezuela is flooding the US with drugs or presents any threat to the USA or Canadian security. Venezuela produces no coca nor poppy. Drug agencies have stated clearly that there is no credible evidence that President Nicolas Maduro directs any narco gangs, that only 5% of drugs going to the US pass through Venezuela, that the country has a status as a territory free from coca leaf cultivation or drug production, as well as free from international criminal cartels. Canada needs to denounce the US military force in the Caribbean. 22 small outboard motors have been fulminated by US warship missiles, killing 83 innocent people, unidentified, unarmed, no evidence of what they were carrying, no evidence where they were going. They were extrajudicial killings, murder, in other words. The US is in flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter, of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, where the Latin American and Caribbean nations declared a denuclearization of the region, and the Select Proclamation of 2014 that declared the region a zone of peace. An invasion of Venezuela will ignite a long and protracted regional war, like the Vietnam War, a geopolitical conflict, as most of the world's nations have repudiated the US attacks and threats, including the UN, the European Union, BRICS, CARICOM, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, China, Russia, and Iran. Furthermore, polls show that 7 out of 10 US citizens oppose an attack on Venezuela. It is time Canada joined most of the world in repudiating these murders and unlawful threats to Venezuela. If not, history will show that Canada was on the side of murder in the high seas by a nation led by a convicted felon, a liar, and a friend of pedophiles. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, wonderful. So incredible to hear from Maria. Many thanks to her for sending this, even, despite difficult and extenuating circumstances. So we are very much out of time. And so I'm going to close us out. We were able to answer a few of the questions in the chat, but we're going to have to close out for tonight. It's been an extraordinary evening. I think that tonight we have learned that Canadian foreign policy is not neutral, and that from Gaza to Haiti to Venezuela to Congo to Chile to Cuba to China to Ukraine, Canada is deeply entangled in a global order that uses sanctions, coups, military alliances, aid, and on to protect corporate power, to protect Western dominance, and that feeds back into racism, into austerity, and into climate breakdown at home. So I want to end by returning to the political stakes in the NDP leadership race. When a party sidelines or blocks a campaign that insists on talking about these important issues, Gaza, Haiti, Congo, Venezuela, Chile, Cuba, Palestine, xenophobia, the global south, that insists on taking on arms sales, NATO, the core group, the Five Eyes, it's effectively saying that the people most harmed by Canadian foreign policy do not matter enough to be centered in its politics. And this is not a small disagreement about tone or about focus. If we're serious about anti-racism here in Canada, if we're serious about human rights, if we're serious about being activists, humanists, we have to be anti-imperialist, anti-war, anti-genocide, and unapologetically internationalist. We have to insist that foreign policy is not a side issue and that it is central to what justice looks like in Canada. We can't build a truly just, decolonial, anti-racist society at home while backing wars, occupation, sanctions that crush Black, Brown, Indigenous people abroad. And so that's why we're saying tonight that internationalism belongs in the NDP leadership race. And it's why the pressure that you all are helping to build inside and outside of the party really matters. It's really important. So I just want to end by thanking all of our speakers for giving your time and insight. Thank you, Vijay, Tamara, Craig, Carmen, Patrick, Amina, Karen, Jenny, Patasana, Kevin, Khaled, William, Glenn. Thanks as well to Hossein and Fariba for allowing us to use their trailer, and Maria for sending in her film. To our volunteers behind the scenes, Gabby, Zachariah, and all of you for spending your evening here with us and insisting that internationalism, anti-imperialism, and real anti-racism all belong at the heart of our politics. So thanks again for joining us. Take care, good night, and peace. Good night, everyone.